Hey everybody, welcome to The Brunt of It. I'm your host Joel Van Brunt. Welcome. I do need to start doing my call to action in the beginning of these videos, so click like, hit subscribe. That'll keep you updated on what's coming down range. This is episode 31 of The Brunt of It, and I am your host Joel Van Brunt. So click like, hit subscribe, and if you want to find out how to support me, just contact me on Twitter. If you're going to outsource your thinking, why not do it with somebody you trust? And if you're not going to outsource your thinking, why not allow me to point you in the right direction to build your awareness? I can be an aggregator of information and help you think about things from maybe some sides that you hadn't considered before. I'm interested in grown-up conversations, not fifth grade bully sessions at recess. That seems all too much what we have today. And I can help you build discernment, wisdom, control your emotions so we can think clearly about things. Who would have thought that the axis of kindness and civility would become niche in today's world? But that's in fact where we are. Free speech, arguments around whether free speech is under attack or not. I'm going to get into some of that today with free thought and free expression and whatnot. So who am I? I have had 21 years of experience in the public and private sectors. I've been in the military, and I've been in the aviation field, tourism, entertainment, politics, academia, entrepreneurship, government, and the military. In various roles, I've led, coached, and mentored teams of up to 280, 290 people, including hiring, recruiting, and firing people. I've lived in 16 different places across 8 states, and my work has brought me to 12 states to work. So I have literally experienced almost all U.S. cultures: New York, New England culture, the South, the Midwest, the left coast, and I've been in Hawaii for the last 7 years. So most recently the Hawaiian culture. I aim to help get you through the fog of war in life. What is the fog of war? Military term. That is basically the uncertainty that we all walk around with on any given day that we may or may not be aware of. So we are in the midst of sometimes contradictory information, sometimes opposing information, and it's hard to sort out what information is accurate and actionable, and we have to act. We have to decide in this environment what we believe, what we don't believe, when to reserve judgment, when to pass judgment, and how that incorporates into our beliefs, structure, and our values. So I aim to help guide you through that philosophically, culturally, politically, and I want to do so with presenting some ideas, some big ideas in these shows for you to consider. For you to consider to be a more effective thinker and a more effective communicator on these topics. So I've introduced these principles just to cover them briefly. The principle of awareness. Are you aware of all of the counterpoints, the arguments on both sides of an issue? What's the steel man of the other side? Steel man is a term that that suggests that you really make the opposing point of view's argument as strong as possible, not make it less powerful and then just tear it down, because it's easy to tear down a bad argument. So, principle of awareness, the principle of discernment. So when you have information coming into your brain, whether it's from a news story or a reporter, really taking that information captive, like the Bible talks about. Take captive every thought that comes into your mind and interrogate it and figure out why it's there. Is it to provide you more information, to give you better understanding of an issue? Is it to persuade you towards a certain point of view with arguments? Is it to persuade you through emotion? Is it just to connect with your prior existing emotional beliefs, your emotional propensity to demonize somebody who you both don't like? Is it to make the writer look smart? Is it to make you feel dumb? There's a whole slew of reasons for why information comes in, and discerning what's what is a helpful skill. It's also helpful to discern what's truth and what's not, and to figure out the context, to discern when the context has been removed, to discern when certain words have been subtly changed, to discern when there is fake news. And I mentioned yesterday the various aspects of fake news. So really funny with the Dave Rubin and Scott Adams interview, where Dave Rubin says, you have to make sure the story matches the headline. And who would have thought that? How many of us have just scanned the headlines and not read the story? And we may not know which headlines have the story that matches the headline and which stories have which stories do not match the headline. And if we don't know that, we don't have an awareness of that, then the headline is going to have an impact on how we think about things one way or the other. It could put up a wall, or it could just confirm our prior existing biases. So helping with that principle of discernment. And then finally, the principle of sticky narratives. And I like to frame the world in this way, that everybody has a narrative. Everybody has a story or a way to make sense of the world around us. And where we fall out on our religious beliefs, where we fall out on our cultural beliefs, our political beliefs, even in the business environment or in the military. So if you've worked in an organization and you've seen a degradation in relationships, maybe friction in relationships, perhaps you've experienced what I've experienced, where somebody that you work with has a few interactions with another person you work with, and those interactions are not favorable, or they're negative. The first impression's not good, and then the second impression's not good. And then before too long, this person is creating a narrative about that other person that's negative. Now, you may have different interactions with that person. Maybe your interactions are 10 to 1, the number that your counterpart has with that individual. And you form a different narrative, which is more positive, maybe more balanced, because you have more data points. And then you try to educate your fellow employee that perhaps their narrative isn't the full picture. I've done that before, and that's hard. Those are hard conversations, because you are fighting against a sticky narrative. The sticky narrative being that certain data points are anchored in people's minds, and they draw a narrative through them, and it sticks, and it anchors people to that position. So the principle of sticky narrative, you see that literally all over the place, and we're all susceptible to sticky narratives. We are all susceptible to confirmation bias and cognitive dissonance. So it cuts every which way but loose. And the only thing we can do is try to constantly build our awareness, constantly develop tools for discernment in the information we're taking in, and allow our narratives to be pushed against with disconfirming or disagreeing information, so that our narrative can be updated, and the story that we've made sense of the world can be slightly adjusted. So that's the way we do it. And boy, that thing is annoying. How do I turn that off? Let's see. I'm not going to do it. Okay. So those are some principles I want to talk about. So big to small improvement. I did a lot of prep work today, so I hope you enjoyed the show. It's going to lead you through some big ideas and some things going on in the news. And I'm trying to get better at my presentation, and I'm trying to get disciplined and making sure I stick with it. So I want to stick with it because I really enjoy this. I get a lot out of it, and I'm hoping that at some point this will be more self-sustaining and less just a hobby, but more of a thing I can do, devote even more energy to. Right now, I'm a couple hours a day to prepping and recording this. So I want to continue to get better and refine the ideas and the thinking, and provide you more value. And so I hope to balance that with big idea concepts and what's going on in the news. And I'm trying to figure out how to weld those two together in interesting ways. So let's dive right in. I want to first talk about this concept that's come up recently, although it's not new, and that's this idea of cancel culture. I'm going to have to silence this. How do I do that? Okay, you are super duper loud. That's what it is. Okay, so you are gone. Okay, sorry about that. I want to make sure that I crowd out any kind of distracting noise from my computer. I think I've fixed it. So I'm not sure if I fixed it on all my devices. Let's see. Oh, yep, that's muted. Okay. All right. So cancel culture. Now, backing up a bit with my military background, one of the things you learn, aside from the fog of war, when you first do your training as a young second lieutenant, one of the other things you learn about is the 3 different levels of warfare. There's the strategic level, there's the operational level, and then there's the tactical level. And so I want to kind of go through some of these a little bit. So help frame how political discourse can be looked at in these three different levels. And I'm just going to introduce this idea. I'm starting to play with it, but it starts to make sense to me as I gather more information out there through articles and this cancel culture thing that's come up recently. So strategic level is, you establish goals and then you identify actions to accomplish those goals, and then you dedicate resources to accomplish those actions. So big picture, what are our big picture goals for a campaign, for example, or for the outcome of this big effort? That's the strategic level. The operational level, that's where you can connect the actual tactics, what you're going to do on the ground, with your goals. So here's our goals. Here's some actions we can do, and then it's tying the specific to-do lists back towards the achievement of those goals. And then there's the tactical level, and this involves 4 phases. If you look at Wikipedia, kinetic, direct attack in the military sense, mobility, so the ability to move around, protecting your side, and then finally shock action. So these are 4 concepts in the tactical level of warfare. So I was thinking about this cancel culture and shutting down opposing views in this context of a tactic that is set to achieve a goal. And the goal might be to persuade large segments of the population to believe one political side versus the other. And in fact, I covered a few days ago Media Matters when it came into existence in 2011, exclusively really to go through all content on right-wing news outlets and then remove the context and weaponize that information to make those news outlets look less credible. In that example, the strategic goal would be to diminish the credibility of opposing news organizations. Maybe there's a economic reason to do that. Opposing, competitors for people's eyeballs, or, for reading or for watching. And then dedicate resources. In other words, fund this organization called Media Matters. And then, operational is maybe Media Matters is one group, and then maybe there's another group. There's a few other operations that are identified and funded. And then the tactical side would be you literally have people watching Sean Hannity for 9 hours a day, going back through the archives and finding out everything he says that can be weaponized and put out to support the narrative on the opposing point of view and to diminish the credibility of the right-wing outlet. So that's an example. And the cancel culture. So I wanted to go through some of the thinking on cancel culture, and Wikipedia changes it to something called online shaming, because cancel culture, I think, is more in the context of the digital age, where you're trying to go after somebody's the job through social media, through Twitter or Facebook or another platform. And so online shaming is a form of public shaming in which targets are publicly humiliated. This is according to Wikipedia. Online shaming frequently involves exposing private information on the internet. There are 4 types of public humiliation. Doxing, call-outs, cancellation, doxing, negative reviews. There's a 5th one I'm just not going to really cover because it's kind of gross. But I want to go through some of these. So calling out is a form of public humiliation or shaming that basically tries to hold the individual accountable for a perceived offense. So you say something and somebody else takes offense to it, then this call out is a tactic to make you feel shame and public humiliation for that perceived offense. Okay, so never mind your intention to offend. That's kind of irrelevant in these tactics. So the second thing, cancellation. So cancel culture. This is where the cancel culture term comes from. I'm using cancel culture as a more broader umbrella. But according to Wikipedia, cancel culture describes a form of boycott in which someone, usually a celebrity, who has shared a questionable or controversial opinion or has had behavior in their past that is perceived to be offensive, called out on social media is canceled. They are boycotted by their former followers or supporters, leading to declines in celebrities' careers and fan bases. So we've seen this in trying to boycott advertisers of certain outlets. This has been a tactic for a while. So Breitbart or Ben Shapiro, his outfit, or Laura Ingraham getting outraged at the advertisers and then attacking them economically through that cancellation. Third one, doxing. So this is when you are revealing personally identifiable information about an individual with the intention to harm them, usually to fire them or get them in trouble with their employer or their neighbors or their community or whatever. So that's doxing. And what's interesting about this is that in the case of doxing, the term personally identifiable information, in the military context, every single military person in the Department of Defense has to go through annual training about protecting personally identifiable information. And that's a force preservation strategy because obviously you don't want personally identifying information of your armed services getting out to would-be enemies and opponents in future conflicts. But it's interesting that this is exactly the tactic. It's a wartime tactic. You're exploiting personally identifiable information to mitigate that person's influence and to remove them as a threat in the idea space. And these are all typically ideas that we're talking about and speech. They're not actions. Okay, there might be actions that cross over that are representative of some sort of speech or demonstration, but most of these tactics are in the context of speech. Because in social media, you could play a video, and a video might have action in it, but you're really communicating ideas via the platform to each other. Okay, and then negative reviews is another one. So threats on TripAdvisor, Yelp, or Facebook, or Google Books to shame or punish businesses or individuals. And negative reviews is something I've dealt with in small business, where you'll have essentially blackmail from guests who want refunds. And they will blackmail businesses by threatening to write a bad review. And so this is so common that places like Yelp and TripAdvisor actually have a blackmail reporting function within their platforms. In other words, if you receive a credible threat of blackmail, then you can put in the information on TripAdvisor, and the person's any kind of email address or something like that or name, and then TripAdvisor will kind of hold on to that. And if a review is posted that meets the criteria that you've presented, and your justification meets their terms of service, they will not allow that review to post. So it's a very nice thing for small businesses that get blackmailed by customers who customers who never be happy. We've all seen customers that just they will not be happy. We've all probably been out at restaurants with friends who, well, not recently, but in the past, we've been to restaurants with friends who, it doesn't matter what the service is, they're not going to be happy with it, and they're going to mention it. They're going to mention the service, and that maybe they'll leave a poor tip, or maybe they'll complain to a manager. So we've all seen, customers who aren't happy. And if anybody's ever worked at Starbucks out there, I mean, you guys have more stories than anybody. My wife used to work at Starbucks, and the stories she would tell of entitled guests who were just never happy blew my mind. And then when I started to get involved in service industry, small businesses, I saw it firsthand. So if you haven't lived that, then you haven't seen it, and you don't really know how nasty people can be in the blackmail space. And the last one, I'm not going to talk about it, but revenge porn, posting nasty images or pictures to get revenge at somebody for harming you for a grievance. So this is kind of gross, but this is kind of the common, thing in today's social media is this cancel culture. And it made me think about those tactics in the context of those three levels of warfare, right? And starting all the way back with Media Matters and before that, where you have organizations' sole purpose to pull information, weaponize it in order to support a narrative, and to diminish the credibility of the other side. So anytime you diminish the credibility of the other side, this is the ad hominem attack in argument, in logic, and it's a fallacy. You can't disprove an argument by attacking the person making the argument. And all these tactics are essentially just designed to do that, right? I mean, all you're doing is attacking the person. You're actually masking this whole ad hominem effort with all these different, goals of diminishing the other side and persuading people towards your side. This is really unhelpful, and it's kind of gross, and it doesn't make our dialogue better, right? It makes it actually worse because people start to get fearful of voicing their true opinions, as is the thought brought up in a Quillette article from a few years back by none other than the editor-in-chief, Claire Lehman. So she has an article. This is back in 2019, so a little bit over a year ago. And it says, "We must defend free thought." And what turned me onto this article, I've been reading Quillette for well over a year. I don't believe I read this at the time, but what turned me onto this was that it discusses a blogger that I just came into contact with yesterday. And that's this blogger from Slate Star Codex. This was mentioned in Scott Adams' podcast yesterday. And his name is Scott Alexander. So I wanted to read a little bit of it because if you are somebody who is in the minority intellectual position or political position or religious position, you may have found this before. And so I want to read a little bit of the opening and then I'll skip down. Claire Lehman, "You probably have felt afraid to speak your mind freely at some point, whether it is in the university class, a meeting at work, or amongst friends online. It's likely that you have remained silent when you have had an idea or opinions that haven't conformed to received wisdom. This is not unusual or maladaptive response. In fact, knowing when to stay quiet and knowing how to avoid conflict is a necessary and important part of being an adult. Most arguments are pointless, and there is no reason to get into fights with people whom we otherwise want to cooperate with and build mutually beneficial relationships. Nevertheless, I worry that intellectual self-policing is happening more and more often, particularly for those living in tight-knit and politically homogenous communities. In such environments, challenging and prevailing ideological orthodoxy, even if it's only to plead for more tolerance of diverse viewpoints, can lead to reputational damage, harassment, and in some cases, career suicide. Today, these strictly enforced thought codes are pervading spaces where naturally open-minded and liberal people work, such as academia, media, and the arts. Complying with these repressive codes, and worse, being expected to report those who breach them, sticks in the craw of people with naturally liberal predispositions, even if they share many of the progressive aims of those who enforce these dogmas." Okay. In a lengthy post on his website, the writer and psychiatrist Scott Alexander describes how his life was derailed by those who harassed him over comments made on a Reddit forum related to his blog. The full background story can be found here. But the short version is that because right-of-center people were not completely banned from the thread, and because discussions which were actually diverse took place, people were able to point to the small percentage of comments that included those they considered beyond the pale, hereditarians, anti-feminists, etc., and claimed that the entire thread, and Scott himself, was racist and misogynist, among other sins. Scott points out that it was not trolling that got him and the forum into trouble. It was people expressing themselves in a civil, reasonable way. This is a quote from him. "The fact is, it's very easy to moderate comment sections. It's very easy to remove spam, bots, racial slurs, low-effort trolls, and abuse. I do it single-handedly on this blog, 2,000 plus weekly comments." Regarding Slate Star Codex's volunteer team of 6 moderators did it every day on the CW thread, and you can scroll through the week after week of multiple thousand-post culture war thread and see how thorough a job they did. But once you remove all these things, you're left with people honestly and civilly arguing for their opinions. And that's the scariest thing of all. So we're almost like, I think the point he's making this comment on honesty and how it's the honesty that is most attacked and raises the most ire. So she covers this, and it's really interesting. If someone speaks up against the increasing climate of fear and harassment or the decline of free speech, they get hit with an omnidirectional salvo of you continue to speak just fine and people are listening to you. So obviously the climate of fear can't be too bad. People can't be harassing you too much, and you're probably just lying to get attention. But if someone is too afraid to speak up or nobody listens to them, then the issue never gets brought up. and its mission accomplishment. So the unpleasant reality, this is Claire's voice, the unpleasant reality that we must face today is that there is a small subset of hardline ideologues who oppose open discourse altogether. The fact that you may not feel comfortable speaking your mind openly and may feel afraid of serious consequences is viewed by these people as an accomplishment. It is easy to ignore this reality, but when it harms people we admire and threatens to stifle earnest discussions taking place in good faith, this reality must be dealt with head on. Their position is that debate normalizes unsavory people and that it platforms and that to platform anyone with right of center views is the equivalent of legitimizing Nazis. We haven't heard that narrative, have we? Has anybody heard that narrative before in the last 3 years? This fanatical minority is tiny in number, but has successfully cowed university administrators, corporate leaders, and countless thoughtful people into silence. So successful are their tactics that they have instilled climates of fear in institutions that were established with the explicit purpose of defending free speech. If these institutions cannot resist such vandals, who can? So this is a really, really great critique of modern cancel culture. And it is true that a lot of folks don't like the debate because they don't like platforming opposing views that they view as so reprehensible as to not have a voice. Now, this goes back to this Overton window concept. If you've never heard of the Overton window, what that is it's a range of what is considered acceptable for public discourse. So outside of the range, you can't really talk about it in public. And you could think of some, maybe obscene things that you wouldn't want to talk about in public. And this Overton window flexes in and out in terms of the range, the array of things that are fit for public discourse. And so what happens is when you have this cancel culture and shutting down of views, that Overton window starts to narrow. And the orthodox views become very, very narrow and focused. And then because it defines anything outside that window as not worthy of platform, then you have a basically brainwashing towards groupthink, towards common thought, and any kind of challenging idea starts to get crowded out. Sticky narratives, right? And it's this Overton window shrinking that is trying to reinforce this narrative on the left. In this case, cancel culture comes mostly from the left, at least today in 2020. And it's trying to reinforce a sticky narrative that the left has about the evils of society and the racist culture we live in and historical injustices and victimhood in American life. So, these big things that are accusations out there. So I just think that this is really interesting that there's a whole army out there in the Twitter sphere, the trolls, the comment threads. If you look at if you're on Twitter at all, if you're not, that's cool. If you are, then the information that you can glean from that. And if you look at the trends, like for example, today I was looking at a trend and it was President Bush was a trending 2 words. So I was like, what's going on with that? Is he sick? What's going on? So you click in there and the first 100 things that show up are hatred, like not just criticism or critique, but hatred of President Bush. And I just found that to be fascinating that, that people these are probably the same people who would be against hate in other contexts, but they're like literally feeding on it in the Twitter sphere. So it's a really interesting time we live in. And then I want to finish this thought with a gentleman, Nick Searcy. He's an actor in LA. And because I lived in LA for a year and a half and I kind of experienced this a little bit, and I met Andrew Breitbart back in 2009 or 2010. When he was in LA, he had a lot of LA connections at the time when he was developing Breitbart News. And it's a really interesting 3-part series that Nick Searcy has in Red State, which talks about the narrative business. And I remember when I was in LA, I was discouraged that there weren't more openly conservative people, open Republicans in Hollywood, who would be who would be pushing narrative from a wholesome, all-American conservative perspective. Now, these stories do get made, as we'll see in a second. But and I remember talking to conservatives in Hollywood who, just going back to the Claire Lehman article from a minute ago, were in fear of publicly stating some of their opinions or positions, because that would mean not getting parts. That would mean not getting auditions. That would mean getting shunned in the industry. That would mean that your project wouldn't get picked up by investors. A whole bunch of real world ramifications. And I remember Andrew Breitbart telling me so many stories of Hollywood people. There was almost like a support group that he built in Hollywood for these professionals in the industry that didn't have anybody they could talk to about their ideas, because they would be shamed, they would be rejected, they would be canceled before cancel culture, as it's called now, became a thing. But it's the same concept, right? And this goes all the way back to the 80s when Reagan was reelected, was his earliest story. So this is nothing new, but Nick Searcy, I like him because he's an actor in LA. He's a Republican, conservative. He writes for Red State. And he has a 3-part essay series, which I would encourage you to go check out. And part 1, he talks about how conservatives have kind of like pulled back from LA, and they've taken the position of boycotting it as opposed to getting into it or setting up a opposing industry that compete with it, kind of like Nashville competes with LA loosely in the music scene. And so he says, hey, we gotta get back in the narrative business because there's an underserved audience. And he mentions that some stories still come out of LA, like A Quiet Place, which was a movie from a few years ago, very conservative values promoted in that place. And then Chernobyl came out on HBO, and Rush Limbaugh talked about it. And these 2 pieces were very good. They did very well, very successful, both on Netflix and in the box office for A Quiet Place. But they garnered criticism from within LA. In the case of The Quiet Place, they accused Krasinski, the director and actor in it, of being a closet conservative and promoting, gun rights, Southern Christian values. Even though he came out publicly and supported Elizabeth Warren in this most recent election. And then Chernobyl, Rush Limbaugh talked about it, and that was like the worst thing you could ever think of. And the reason Rush Limbaugh talked about it and recommended it, he was recommending this miniseries in HBO, is because of its portrayal of the Soviet Union, basically covering up the biggest nuclear disaster in history. So that was part 1. Part 2 talks about his own story, his own film that he produced and directed called Gosnell. And Gosnell was a real-life account a true crime story about a real-life case of abortion doctor Kermit Gosnell, who was convicted of multiple crimes in 2013, including murder for snipping the necks of babies after they had been born, which, of course, is arguably now legal in the state of New York. So he made this movie, and he basically, it was a big court case, and he was found guilty, I think, convicted of multiple crimes. So there's a whole bunch of court documents. There's the transcription of the court. So there's literally the words that were used in court in a real live case that I haven't seen the film, so full disclosure on that. But apparently he went to great pains to keep the film accurate to the court transcripts, so they wouldn't be accused of propaganda. Of course, that is the big criticism, right? So he talks about how hard it was not only to get it funded, but once he got it made, to get it distributed, and how no one wanted to be associated with that project because obviously of the ramifications. Because if you started to look at abortion as this thing that may not be okay in certain cases, that was a politically charged position to take, even by just hosting this show and distributing it. So this is a really interesting piece, and it talks about, okay, so after they're distributing it, Facebook blocked over 50 ads for Gosnell, some of them as simple as Gosnell in theaters October 12th, or a short clip of Dean Cain talking about the movie on the Tucker Carlson show. NPR refused to run any ads that called Gosnell an abortionist demanding that the word be changed to the neutral doctor. When the producers offered up the phrase abortion doctor as a compromise, NPR refused, even though their own coverage in the past included headlines like abortion doctors killing appeals to Kansas City High Court, and even convicted Philadelphia abortion doctor Gosnell gets life in prison. Lifetime and Hallmark, two networks whose viewers would definitely intersect with Gosnell audience, refused to run ads, as did every other major network. In fact, the only network that would take our ads was, guess who? That's right, mean old Fox News. We also got some great airtime from talk radio hosts like Glenn Beck, and of course, a big boost from my close and personal friend Rush Limbaugh. And reviews were polarizing. The media treated the movie like they were on trial. The media treated the movie like they treated the trial. They ignored it. They pretended it didn't exist. And the scene that really drove the leftists crazy was the one scene that when I first read the script made me want to direct the movie. In it, Gosnell's defense attorney cross-examines a good abortion doctor called by the prosecution to show the difference between the illegal practices of Gosnell and a legal abortion. You see, when I read the scene, I realized that I did not know what an abortion actually was. I naively thought that this is information that everyone needs to know. Whatever side of the issue they are on, all the dialogue was lifted directly from the court transcripts. It is literally what was said during the trial. So, of course, that's the scene that most of the negative reviews called right-wing propaganda. Gosnell's defense attorney was essentially saying, what's the difference in these two procedures? The result is the same, but the left isn't interested in these facts. And in fact, they don't want anyone else to know these facts either. The entire subject is something they don't really want discussed at all. In the Hollywood narrative, the only thing you need to know about abortion is that if you oppose it, or even want any restrictions on it whatsoever, you are a racist who hates women. Have you seen that before? I have. I mean, I can connect with this story. Living in LA, and what's interesting is that the right-wing propaganda, that the biggest criticism of this film and the one scene in it, he takes great pains to actually lift it straight from the transcript of the court. So they're really fighting against an actual real-life court case and calling that right-wing propaganda from something that really happened in court. That's very, very interesting. And again, this goes to the tactics of ignoring, canceling, shutting it down, not talking about it because of the threat it provides against the narrative. So that's his part 2. And then part 3. I thought part 3 was great, and he just finished that today. I want to mention part 3. So the whole 3-part series is about getting Republicans and conservatives back into narrative businesses. Hollywood and storytelling being one of those. So he goes back, and apparently he likes to mention that he guest hosted Rush Limbaugh back in 2017, and that's kind of an ongoing joke in his articles. But I used to listen to Rush when I was growing up. My dad loved him. I would go through phases where I wouldn't like him anymore. I thought that he was too polarizing. Didn't have the full picture. I wasn't getting all the awareness I needed to. But he was very entertaining, and he also brought up a lot of ideas and discussed ideas in a humorous way, lighthearted, that I wasn't exposed to in any other way. And this was back in the late 80s and early 90s. And I started to not listen to him as much. But I realized what made me upset after I stopped listening to him as much as I did is when my dad would listen to him almost exclusively. And I thought, you really don't want to get all of your news from one source. You got to at least have a little bit of a balance, 2 at a minimum, even if they're on the same side, because you're going to start to notice distinctions between the two sources. And those distinctions will force you into thinking about issues and where you come out. Do you agree with this thinker more, or do you agree with this thinker more? And then you throw a third one in the mix, and oh boy, now it's game on. So part of this effort of this show is to provide you a multiplicity of sources and to present them and to make commentary on them so that you can consider whether you agree with them or not and how much they challenge your own sticky narrative. So all returning to Rush, because again, just like LA, Rush is personal to me because I have background with him, but I had never been exposed to this line of thinking. And I'm quoting from the article now. For you young whippersnappers out there, it is hard to understand what life was like before Rush. There was no one, and I mean No one like him. There was no Fox News, no Sean Hannity, not really even a talk radio format, not on a national level. There was no alternative to the Alphabet Network's relentlessly biased reporting. And the Alphabet Networks before CNN, this was ABC, NBC, CBS. That's it. You had 3 sources of information for the news. You had print media, and that was it. That was your exclusive. Those 3 were the exclusive sources of television media for countless years, 30, 40 years. Rush, almost completely by himself, destroyed the monopoly the left had on the news business, and his effect on the culture has been immeasurable. Rush changed Andrew Breitbart, Rush changed me, and countless other listeners, which is why they have tried and failed for 30 years to destroy him. They know how effective he has been. He totally changed the culture, mostly by fearlessly standing up to his haters and showing the rest of us that it could be done, and that it was fun to do it. Rush taught us to laugh at them when we confronted them. And I remember when Rush got presented the Presidential Medal of Freedom in this last State of the Union, and how that caused a whole uproar from people who hate Rush. And for me, I thought it was very, very fitting, because there's no question Rush has influenced an immeasurable number of people in this country, simply by connecting with some of their core beliefs and offering them thoughts and thinking and commentary about issues that no one else was providing. And that goes directly to the theme of this 3-part series, which is that there's an underserved audience that is craving this kind of content. That's why Fox News became so popular starting back in 1996. So, and I want to tie this to a thing I mentioned in a show a week or so ago, which was that there's a study by this was in the film Hoaxed by Mike Cernovich, which if you haven't seen, you should go out and see it. You should also go see Planet of the Humans, the recent film by Michael Moore. He as a producer. But the reason I mention this is because Rush got big in talk radio in the early 90s. Now, he was in radio before that. He was in television before that. He had some failed, guest hosting of Donahue, that old 80s talk show. He was on TV for a bit. And I remember those days. I was old enough to remember those days where he didn't do well there, and then he went into radio, and then he kind of blew up in radio. And this professor, I'm trying to remember the university he was at, but he was featured in Mike Cernovich's documentary. And he looked at the history of the media, and he found that beginning in about 1970, media turned more polemic. Polemic is more of an argumentative style, attacking the opposite point of view, as opposed to starting with your point of view and simply defending it with good arguments, and then recognizing the arguments on the opposite side, and then concluding why you don't find the other arguments persuasive. And not the weak arguments on the other side, but the strongest arguments on the other side. That's critical thinking. Well, polemics is just really going after the other point of view, and kind of doing it in an emotional way. And there's a place for polemics, but this analysis was that about 1970 is when the polemicist tactics started to get employed in major media outlets. So for 20 years before Rush got on the scene, that was the world we lived in the 80s, in the Reagan years. So this is really, really interesting. I would really encourage you to go look out Nick Searcy. Follow him on Twitter. He's a talented guy. He's got some funny content out there. But all right, that's the big stuff. So 43 minutes in, let's talk about a little bit about COVID-19 updates, the fog of war. I was going to talk about the soccer lawsuit that just got struck down in court, but I don't think I want to spend a lot of time on that. Go read it. It's interesting. The short story is that the women's soccer team, in their collective bargaining agreement, actually agreed to the way in which they were paid. And so when it turned out that way, which was a little more stable, less risky, ended up being less money than the men's soccer team that negotiated a different collective bargaining agreement, and then the women complained about it, the judge was like, you guys agreed to this and you rejected the same model that the men chose. So he threw it out of court. So that's interesting. That's reported in various places. So COVID-19, fog of war. So first, I went outside the U.S. I found this on Twitter, I think, or actually I might have found this through some connections, some private chat connections. So this is from the Independent UK. A research assessment reported to have been compiled by the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance of Western States has stated that the Chinese government deliberately hid or destroyed evidence about the initial outbreak of the coronavirus. This shocked no one, I'm sure. The document charts how Beijing denied at first that the disease could be transmitted between humans, silenced or disappeared medics who tried to warn of the outbreak, blocked access to international organizations to Wuhan, where it originated, and refused to provide live samples to international scientists trying to find a vaccine. That's pretty bad. So the Five Eyes comprise of the US, UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And that's where this report comes from. So when Donald Trump starts to take a harsh position on China and the WHO, this is why. All this cover-up and the WHO publicly not really pushing back against China's, actions at the time that were kind of known. It's if countries are knocking on the door saying, hey, can you guys let our experts in there to kind of figure out what's going on? And China says, no, you just need to believe the information we're giving you. That should raise some red flags, shouldn't it? Why would you not allow outside experts if you have the intent of acting in good faith with your world neighbors? But that was the case in Wuhan. So that's what the Independent UK is reporting. And then to make it more complicated, Scott Gottlieb, who you should follow on Twitter, he's a former head of the FDA, or I think the FDA or one of the agencies, CDC maybe. He has a Twitter thread that says that talks about hospitalizations and the trend in hospitalizations, and he argues that the hospitalizations should be the major indicator of where we are in this pandemic. Hospitalizations are an objective measure of the direction of the COVID epidemic in the U.S., whether it's expanding or contracting. This data shows that COVID hospitalizations nationally appears to be continuing to increase, with the exception of the tri-state area in the New York region. So he's saying, just be careful because the data is showing that it's increasing. And sure enough, he draws the graphs and he's got some lines. Here's some data from March 25th. What the graph shows is that while hospitalizations are declining in New York City and significant infection numbers in New York heavily influence national statistics, once we exclude New York data nationally, we see signs of expanding epidemic. Note the data is aggregated from states that report hospitalization trends. About 60% of states report information on daily hospitalizations. So he shows that. And I looked at that. I said, okay, that's bad. Maybe, and this is posted yesterday, May 1st. Maybe we're still on the upward curve. That's what I was thinking. And then, when you look at the New York City numbers and you aggregate the New York City and the tri-state area numbers on top, the total numbers, including those, then you can see the national numbers going down. But if you take out the New York City and the tri-state area, you see the numbers going up. So what does that tell you? What does that tell you? I mean, you would think that, it tells you how do you atomize, how do you break down and segment the data that's meaningful from the data that's not meaningful, or when you do break it down in segment, like removing New York City versus keeping New York City in, how does that lead you to a conclusion that's accurate? Is it the case that if you remove New York City and you see the hospitalizations going up, that's indication that the virus pandemic is still increasing? Not necessarily. If the rate of increase is lower than the rate of decrease, if you add the New York City numbers, wouldn't that suggest that overall it's still decreasing? And wouldn't you expect that if the outbreak really occurred in New York City in the tri-state area, and that's where the predominant 80% of the cases were, then wouldn't it make sense that as it gets outside the tri-state area, the rest of the country would have slight levels of increase? I mean, that makes sense to me. So it's not clear what this is actually trying to show. And I just offer that as another example of the COVID fog of war, that we have competing contradictory evidence. And I guarantee you, people are going to latch on to this tweet and use it to bash their political opponents. I haven't read the comments, but it wouldn't take me too long to find one that did exactly that. And to add to the complexity, the NBC, I don't know how I missed this. I reported a little bit on it a few days ago, but not because I saw it in the news, I don't think, although maybe I did. But I was reporting on how the world economy downturn, the economic downturn in the world, was going to increase poverty rates. I think I did see it in the news now that I think about it. But this from NBC News from a few days ago, UN warns of hunger pandemic amid threats of coronavirus, economic downturn. An additional 130 million people could be on the brink of starvation by the end of 2020 as the result of the outbreak and its economic ramifications. So point one, I think when I discussed this earlier, I mentioned how for all the flack that capitalism and free markets gets, the reality is the world economy and free markets and capitalistic endeavors has been responsible for a large rise in standard of living for the world and bringing millions, hundreds of millions of people out of poverty and actually eating diets that they wouldn't have otherwise ate, just maybe 10 or 20 years earlier. So this is actually taking a trip backwards in time, and you can see what the correlation is between economic input and economic activity and starvation. I mean, if there's a clear correlation, now correlation doesn't mean causation, okay, for you statisticians out there, but if you want to see a clear correlation between economic activity and starvation, this forecast is it. We'll see if it ends up being reality. But imagine that, 120, 130 million people on the brink of starvation by the end of this year. The cure worsens the disease. I just offer that. Is this an example of the cure being worse than the disease? Let's say this pans out, and in December, the UN comes back and says that indeed 130, 140, 100 million people are now below the poverty line, or below the bare minimum subsistence level living line, where they're literally starving. Are we going to have the same view of the lockdown that we do now? I don't know. I just offer that as a question I'll put out there. I don't have a decision on it myself yet. Other news, remdesivir has gone through an emergency FDA approval to do trials, as reported in various news outlets. And I wanted to go over a Wall Street Journal opinion piece on this because, the Democratic debates, you get a lot of one side of the story about pharmaceutical companies and about healthcare in America. And sometimes the conservative, the Republican side, gets glossed over, not mentioned, torn down, caricaturized, dismissed, and not taken seriously. But this article puts a little of the ideas into a way that's easily digestible. So I want to start with this. Painstaking science has been the biggest factor in remdesivir. So it's using the remdesivir case as a launching point for this discussion. Painstaking science has been the biggest factor in remdesivir's success so far, but America's market and legal system also helped Gilead make this contribution to human health. Gilead is the manufacturer of this drug. In this system, privately owned biotech and pharmaceutical companies, financed by investor capital, seek to invent, develop, and distribute new medications. Patent protection provides drug companies with additional incentives over and above those normally provided by the market to undertake the necessary risks. The incentives come from the governmental protection of the intellectual property and the associated ability temporarily to charge prices above the marginal cost of production. Even so, drug companies and their investors reap rewards from their successes and suffer losses from when their efforts fail. Drug development is fundamentally a process of discovery. Scientists discover what works against disease and how to formulate chemical and biological compounds that deliver medicines to patients. To continue discovering new drugs, pharmaceutical companies must cover the costs of the inevitable failures. About 70% of drugs never make it to market because they prove ineffective or too toxic. Drugs typically gain approval only after many years of development. Charging more than the cost of production at a price customers are willing to pay allows developers to recoup these costs. Remdesivir is a case in point. Gilead scientists determined more than a decade ago that the drug would be an effective antiviral and tested its effects on various viruses. Research on remdesivir as a treatment for childhood respiratory diseases began in 2010. Though the drug ultimately failed in that purpose, Gilead continued to research its potential. Several years later, the company discovered that the drug might work against Ebola. But after several remarkable individual success stories, the drug again failed to live up to its promise. Fortunately for patients, other drugs became available. Despite this setback, Gilead continued its research. Its scientists uncovered evidence that remdesivir might work against two coronaviruses, those behind SARS and MERS. But with the major outbreaks of those diseases having passed, there weren't enough patients for pivotal human trials. When the novel coronavirus was identified a few months ago, Gilead immediately began working with the FDA, along with other health agencies in the U.S. and worldwide, to expedite human trials of remdesivir. Meanwhile, the FDA approved compassionate use access to the drug for more than 2,000 gravely ill patients. So it's making the case that this kind of innovation, where private companies take these risks and absorb the 70% failure rate, which, by the way, if you're a business and you have a 70% failure rate, of bringing a product to market, that is a very high failure rate. Imagine Google or Facebook being in 70% range. And I'm saying this speculatively. I don't think they're anywhere close to 70% failure rate in terms of what they hope to be revenue generating. They might have a lot of projects that don't succeed, but 70%, and you just know that historically over 20, 30 years or 50 years, whatever the time frame that they look at for that stat comes from. So when you remove the incentives, and this goes back to what I talked about yesterday with tax policy in Hawaii, when you remove the incentives or change the incentives for companies to take risks and for innovation to occur, then it's hard to appreciate the result of that, because we don't have the counterfactual too much in our current situation, except that we know a lot of other countries will come to the U.S. for a lot of our pharmaceutical development, and so a lot of the drugs will be outsourced and spread to other places in the world. And other countries don't have the same level of innovation. They do have innovation. This is not to say they have no innovation. It's just not to the same scale. It's not to the same level as the U.S. So you can't have a free lunch. You can't have this super high level of innovation if there's not a cost to it. So if you change the incentive structures for pharmaceutical companies or for doctors, then people are going to make different decisions about what risks to take. So let's say that remdesivir proves to be successful in treating COVID-19. Now, it hasn't been proven yet, but let's say it is. Then this is a wonderful example. Where else would remdesivir or a drug like it have come from if not for the U.S. and our current, the way our current structure allows risk-taking behaviors? So I offer that for the opposite side of the narrative that all pharmaceutical companies are evil, profiteering, money-grubbing bastards. All right. The last COVID-19 thing I want to talk about is from the New York Times, and this just is funny. So, I'm going to imagine a hypothetical, and then I'll talk about the story. So, let's say that you've disbanded an organization for a long period of time. You didn't even do it. Somebody, it's an organization you work closely with, but their leadership decided to disband that organization, have everybody stay home. Everybody lives all over the country, so everybody went back home, and they've been there for weeks and weeks and weeks. And every once in a while, they'll come back to the organization to do something important, and then they'll go back home. And so then there's plans to bring people back, and there's a doctor for this organization that's the primary person who kind of provides frontline care for all of the members of this organization. And the doctor says, hey, just so you know, we don't really have enough tests to do screening of everybody. I have tests and I can screen people, but I can't do it for everybody in this organization. And then the organization's leadership says, well, who can provide it? Oh, well, this partner organization can do it. They can provide it. Well, did you ask them? You know what? I'll ask them right now. Pick up the phone. Hey, can you guys give us some tests so we can, we're going to meet next week, and I want to make sure we have screening for everybody. It's really important stuff we're doing. Can you guys send over tests? And on the other end of the phone, oh yeah, absolutely, sure, yeah, absolutely, we'll do it right away. It's coming, and you let me know if we need to send more. Click. Okay, imagine that's a story, because if I'm a business and I have the capacity to provide that to an organization that I work closely with, that's a parallel organization, one of our partners, and I don't know of the request, and I'm not a mind reader, and as soon as I get the request, and if I have the capacity to do it, oh, absolutely, yeah, of course. So that's probably the normal business operations of most organizations who have the capacity to help sister organizations or whatnot. Now we get to the article. Title: Capitol lacks tests for returning senators while White House tests many in Trump's circle. As senators prepare to return Monday, Congress's doctor warned that he does not have the capacity to test all 100 for coronavirus. At the White House, the president and many of his aides are tested repeatedly. Dr. Brian Moynihan, a tight-lipped doctor who attends to Congress, sent up on Thursday what some have construed as a warning. His office, he told senior Republican officials in a private conference call, cannot screen all 100 senators for the coronavirus when they return to work on Monday. 2 miles down Pennsylvania Avenue at the White House, the story is very different. President Trump and Vice President Michael Pence are tested frequently. Aides who come into close contact with them are tested weekly, and the list of people who need to be tested daily keeps expanding, according to officials familiar with the process. The stark contrast between the testing haves at the White House and the have-nots on Capitol Hill, first reported in Politico, makes clear that Mr. Trump's pronouncement that anybody that wants a test can get a test, as he said on March 6th at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, is far from true. Okay. So you could tell where this article stands, right? Now, I want to go down because buried in this is this paragraph. The White House appears to agree. Shortly after 11 p.m. Friday, Mr. Trump's health secretary, Alex M. Azar II, made an announcement on Twitter. Good news. As the Senate reconvenes to do important work for the American people during the public health crisis, we have now received an initial request and are sending 3 Abbott point-of-care testing machines and 1,000 tests for their use. Conference call on Thursday. Mr. Azar's tweet on Friday saying, the tests are on the way. What's the story? What's the story? The story is comparing and contrasting the haves and the have-nots in this narrative that is activating people's emotional biases and making them shake their fists at the newspaper and say, those damn people in the administration. And this is just simply a silly, silly story, in my view. And it's a great example of the credibility getting hit hard when you give stories like this. The story should be Congress asked for tests and get tests. That should be the story, because that seems to be what's in the article. I'm just taking information from the article. I haven't even looked outside this article. So I want to use that as just a silly way of manipulating context and manipulating information, weaponizing it to build up and support and sustain a narrative. All right, shifting to politics. Trump is replacing his HHS Inspector General, I guess, quoted as a watchdog. And I thought this was an interesting story. So the reason being that I guess she gave a report that showed how underprepared hospitals were, and they didn't have all the required equipment. So the story suggests that Trump heard about this, and he actually did ask about this in a press briefing of the media who was asking him the question, and now he's replacing her. So he made her look bad, or she made him look bad. And now he's going to fire her and replace her. And she's the watchdog. So now Trump is showing that he doesn't want watchdog people in his administration. And I was thinking about this. I was like, wait, she works for HHS. HHS is in the executive branch. And then in this article, it says that they serve at the pleasure of the president. So this story is simply chief executive chooses to replace the inspector at this location. That's the story. That's the story. If you want truly a watchdog that's independent, why don't you make it part of the legislature and have the oversight function that the Senate is supposed to do, or the House is supposed to do, Congress is supposed to do. Have that function, pull people up and ask, put the HHS on the stand and ask them questions about what's going on. Congress can do that. Why delegate that to the executive branch, and then make criticism when the chief executive chooses to change out his staff? Again, a silly story in my view. Now, what if it's all true? What if Trump didn't like looking bad and he was all angry and upset and wants to replace her? Who cares? What's the case to be made that what she did was releasing this report publicly? What's the case to be made that she probably should have gone up the chain of command before she released the report? Is there a case that can be made that that's the case? I think so. I think if you have data and you are blindsiding your bosses, that's never a good plan, ever, at any organization. If you have data and you release it publicly and it blindsides your boss or your boss's boss or your boss's 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 boss, that's a bad idea. And that will get you fired in 9 out of 10 cases. So there you go. Michael Flynn, I want to cover this real quick. Michael Flynn, boy, this is blowing up. There's a piece on the Hill. And this piece on the Hill is by Mark Penn, who used to be a pollster and advisor for Bill Clinton back in the 90s, even during the Monica Lewinsky thing. So he writes an article in the Hill called The smoking gun, let's see, Flynn documents are the smoking gun on Comey's FBI. This is a really fascinating piece. And it kind of helps to flush out what's really going on. I'm going to quote from down in the article a little bit. Let's be candid. Flynn had been cleared of being a Russian agent on January 4th, 2017. There was never any evidence he should have been investigated in the first place. Yet now, because the investigation had not been officially closed, and by the way, he just made that statement based on the evidence that has been released, the 11 pages that got released on Thursday. There's never any evidence that she should have been investigated at all. Yet now, because the investigation had not been officially closed, FBI officials cooked up a plan to try to create a crime that did not exist. They unmasked the private conversations of Flynn with the Russian ambassador that contained nothing illegal. So the only chance to get Flynn was by setting a perjury trap. This was then all picked up by special counsel Mueller's team, who threatened Flynn with the possible lobbying transgression of his son. Why were they desperate to get Flynn fired or prosecuted where there was no evidence whatsoever that he committed a crime? Well, former federal prosecutor Andrew McCarthy suggests they needed to get him out of the way of their investigation. I think it is more likely that they simply wanted to get their targets at all costs and sustain their investigation to bring down the administration. Clear prosecutorial abuses were committed against all the defendants, none of whom were ever charged with colluding with the Russians. Manafort was hit with tax evasion, Stone with lying to Congress about his contacts with a conspiracy theorist, Cohen pleaded to financial and election law crimes, Carter Page escaped prosecution, even after an FBI lawyer faked emails from the CIA to continue unconstitutional surveillance of him. This was an investigation without foundation that systematically persecuted people at all costs, and the Mueller investigation was honorable only in the sense that the investigators had to admit there was never any evidence of Trump-Russia collusion. It's all coming out now. So that's that's Mark Penn. And then Andrew McCarthy does have a piece over at National Review that I read. It's pretty complicated. I'm not going to get into it, but he does lay out a pretty good prosecutorial case for intent. Now, I talk a lot about you can't mind read strangers, but when you do have little bits of evidence, and this has been the counterpoint by anti-Trump people, that you have all this piece of evidence that line up to what Trump's thinking and whatnot. And certainly there could be some other narratives, some other stories that explain the evidence in the case of this FBI investigation. But there's not many. There's really not many narratives that make sense. And so Andrew McCarthy really tears it apart today in the National Review article, and he says, and his article is titled, sorry, my kids are yelling outside. His article is titled, "The FBI will set Flynn up to preserve the Trump-Russia probe." So the FBI set up Flynn to preserve the Rush-Trump probe. And he basically makes the case, but because Flynn was going to be the National Security Advisor, which is not a cabinet-level position, thereby not requiring approval from Congress, or confirmation from Congress, that he was going to get in the job January 20th, and he was going to find out the beginnings and the origins of the intelligence investigation against the Trump campaign. And that could not happen, according to them. They had a very limited window, about a 2-week window, to take him out so that he wouldn't uncover the true motives of the investigation. That's at least what the intent argument that Andrew McCarthy makes. And he's been following this story for literally years. I think he wrote a book on it. So this thing is blowing up, and I think we might have indictments pretty soon on this case. And then finally, the Wall Street Journal, the editorial board suggests that the FBI might be in violation of the Brady law. And this is a law from the Supreme Court that required prosecutors to turn over all information that might exonerate a defendant. But the only reason these potentially exculpatory documents are now with Mr. Flynn is because Attorney General Bill Barr this year appointed the U.S. Attorney in St. Louis, Jeffrey Jensen, to review the Flynn case. Mr. Jensen decided to turn over the documents. So the judge in this, Judge Sullivan, should be furious given his own experience with prosecutorial abuse. As he related in a 2017 op-ed in these pages, his wake-up call came in 2008 when he presided over the corruption trial of former Senator Ted Stevens. 6 months after the guilty verdict, it was revealed that the federal prosecutors had concealed numerous pieces of evidence that very likely could have resulted in Stevens' acquittal, wrote Judge Sullivan. So the FBI withheld all this exculpatory evidence from the judges. They didn't, and the Mueller investigation didn't reveal that there was a agreement about not prosecuting his son in exchange for a guilty plea. There's some stuff coming on that should trouble us as freedom-loving Americans, that the government would be able to do this to a citizen. This is troubling. This is very much unconstitutional and going against the Bill of Rights. My kid's yelling. All right, the last thing I'll say is Tara Reade hit a story in CNN today, so they took a long time. Larry King live show on CNN came out recently, and CNN did not break that story. But they have a story today, and what was telling about it is it reminded me of the first mention in the New York Times about the story, which was just the facts, ma'am, what happened. And this CNN article basically takes the same tone. It says, here's what she says, here's who she told, here's who we asked, and it finishes with talking to all the campaign or the staffers of the Biden Senate time, and basically no one, everybody denying that. So CNN now talking about this, but very much taking the New York Times stance of just reporting the facts, no commentary. They're explicitly avoiding the commentary, unlike they did with Christine Blasey Ford, I will mention. So there it is. That's the update on Tara Reade. Lots to get to today. We're about hour and 10 minutes, so hopefully you got a lot out of that. The culture, the cancel culture, these tactics that people use to suppress opposing positions, the power of narrative, and Nick Searcy really advocating for conservatives to get involved in the narrative business, which I agreed with at the time in LA when I was living in Hollywood, and I'm glad that he's still publicly speaking about this. And then talking about COVID-19, the fog of war that we still live in, and some stuff on the Michael Flynn and Tara Reade cases. So hope you got a lot out of it. Hope you have a great Saturday. I will prep and do a show tomorrow unless something comes up. I'll try to do a show tomorrow, but maybe I'll take the day off. We'll see. But episode 31, this is getting fun. I enjoy it. If you enjoy it, let me know, please. Tell me you liked it. Give me some feedback. And I'm Joel Van Brunt. This is The Brunt of It. Goodbye.